house on Blackwood Lane. The rain fell in torrents, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and shadows. The old house on Blackwood Lane creaked and groaned as the storm raged on, its ancient timbers protesting against the onslaught. Inside, Emma sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting eerie shadows on the walls. She had always loved storms, finding comfort in the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the storm seemed alive, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. Emma had inherited the house from her grandmother, a woman known in the town for her mysterious ways and cryptic stories. Despite its dilapidated state, Emma had decided to move in, drawn by the charm and history of the place. Her friends had warned her about the house's sinister reputation, but she had dismissed their concerns as mere superstition. After all, she didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But as the night wore on, she found herself questioning that disbelief. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the rain beat against the windows with relentless fury. Emma pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words swam before her eyes, refusing to make sense. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder made her jump, and she glanced nervously around the room. The fire flickered and dimmed, casting the room into deeper shadow. A sense of unease settled over her, like a heavy, invisible shroud. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner. Its pendulum swung slowly, each tick and tock echoing through the silent house. Midnight was approaching. She decided to make herself a cup of tea, hoping the warm drink would soothe her nerves. As she stood in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, a faint sound reached her ears. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. She strained to hear, but the sound faded, swallowed by the storm. She shook her head, trying to dispel the growing sense of dread. It was just the wind, she told herself. Just the wind and her overactive imagination. The kettle whistled, and she poured herself a steaming cup of tea. As she turned to head back to the living room, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned to face the window. There, framed by the rain-streaked glass, was a figure, dark and indistinct, standing in the yard. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, and the figure was gone. She hurried to the window and peered out into the darkness. But there was nothing there, only the rain and the night. She tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Back in the living room, she set her tea on the table and curled up on the couch, staring into the dying embers of the fire. She needed to calm down, to stop letting her imagination run wild. But the house seemed to have other plans. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. Emma's pulse quickened. She stood up, her hands trembling. She had to find the source of the sound, had to prove to herself that it was nothing more than the wind. She moved cautiously through the house, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder as she approached the stairs leading to the basement. Down into the inky blackness below. She had never liked basements. They always seemed to harbor a sense of malevolence, a place where the darkness was thicker, more oppressive. But the whispers were calling to her, drawing her down. Taking a deep breath, she descended the stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was a cavernous space, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of mold and decay. Emma swept the beam of her flashlight across the room, her heart racing. The whispers were louder here, almost a tangible presence. They seemed to be coming from an old trunk in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. She approached the trunk, her hands shaking. The whispers seemed to coalesce, forming words she could almost understand. She reached out and brushed the dust off the lid, her fingers leaving trails in the grime. With a deep breath, she opened the trunk. Inside, she found a collection of old journals and photographs, yellowed with age. She picked up one of the journals and opened it, the pages brittle under her fingers. The handwriting was her grandmother's, the looping script familiar yet unsettling. As she read, a chill ran down her spine. The journal spoke of strange occurrences in the house, of shadows that moved on their own and voices that whispered in the dark. Her grandmother had written of a presence in the house, something ancient and malevolent that watched and waited. The last entry was dated the day before her grandmother's death. It read, "I fear I have awakened something that should have remained buried. It watches me now, from the shadows. I can hear its whispers, calling to me. I pray that whoever finds this journal heeds my warning. Leave this house, before it claims you too." Emma's hands shook as she closed the journal. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices rising from the walls. She backed away from the trunk, her mind racing. She had to leave, had to get out of the house before it was too late. She turned to run up the stairs, but the basement door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She could feel a presence behind her, cold and malevolent. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight flickering as she did. Standing in the shadows was a figure, its form indistinct and shifting. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its whispers filled her ears. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Desperate, she swung the flashlight at the figure, but it passed through it as if it were made of smoke. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing her cheek. She screamed, the sound echoing through the basement. The last thing she saw was the figure's glowing eyes, filled with a terrible hunger. When the storm finally passed, the house on Blackwood Lane stood silent and empty, its secrets buried once more. The townsfolk whispered of the girl who had moved in and vanished without a trace, another victim of the house's curse. The house remained, waiting for the next soul to claim, its whispers calling out to those who dared to listen.